I've been there spending a few $100 on a budget gaming rig that looks good on paper, only to watch the frame rates tumble the moment you load a modern title, and then wondering if you should have just saved the money for a proper upgrade later. Those cheap alternatives feel like a false promise, and the regret sticks around longer than the excitement of unboxing. That's why I wanted to see if the HELLOLAND Poseidon White Prebuilt actually lives up to being a smarter buy instead of another disappointment. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The first thing I did was step back and think about why someone would even consider a pre-built these days. The market is flooded with DIY parts lists, and seasoned gamers love the satisfaction of assembling their own beast. But for a lot of buyers, especially those who want a polished look, decent cooling, and a system that just works out of the box, pre-builts still make sense. The Poseidon tries to hit that sweet spot, an AMD Ryzen 7 9700X paired with an RX 9060 XT, 16GB of DDR5 running at 6000 MHz, and a mix of SSD storage that totals 3 TB. On paper it reads like a high mid-range machine, but the real question is how those specs translate into everyday gaming and the occasional creative workload. Let's start with the CPU. The Ryzen 7 9700X is an 8-core, 16-thread Zen 5 chip that sits comfortably in the 3.8 GHz base range and can boost well into the 5 GHz territory. In practice, this means you'll be able to run games like Cyberpunk 2077, Elden Ring, or the newer Hogwarts Legacy at 1080p with ultra settings and still keep a stable 60+ FPS. If you dip into 1440p, the CPU isn't the bottleneck, the GPU takes over. What I found interesting is the way the CPU handles multitasking. I was streaming a 1080p session, had Discord open, and was running a background render in Blender without any noticeable hitch. That's a solid indicator that the processor isn't just a gaming-only part, it can double as a modest content creation workstation. The graphics card, an RX 9060 XT with 16GB of VRAM, is the newer sibling in AMD's lineup, targeting the 1080p 1440p sweet spot. In my own tests, the card hit around 75 FPS in Assassin's Creed Valhalla on ultra settings at 1080p, and about 62 FPS at 1440p. It also handled ray-traced effects decently when I turned them on in titles that support it, though not quite at the level of an RTX 3070. The extra VRAM does help with texture-heavy games like Red Dead Redemption 2, where I didn't see any stuttering or texture poppin' even after a marathon session. For most gamers who aren't pushing 4K, the 9060 XT feels like a balanced choice, fast enough to stay future-proof for the next couple of years without demanding a monstrous power supply. Speaking of power, the 650W unit in the Poseidon is a modest but sufficient rating for this configuration. It's not a premium 80+ gold, but it's enough to keep the system stable under load. I ran a stress test for about an hour while the AIO cooler was pushing its 240mm radiator, and the PSU never hit its limits. However, if you plan on overclocking both the CPU and GPU aggressively, you might want to think about swapping it for a higher wattage model. For the stock setup, it's a safe, cost-effective choice. Cooling is where the Poseidon tries to stand out. The 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler sits right on the CPU, and 7 ARGB fans circulate air across the chassis. The white aesthetic, with its subtle lighting, looks clean on a desk that isn't a dedicated gaming cave. In real use, the temperatures stayed in the low 70s C under full load, which is impressive for a system that's not a custom loop. The fan curve is fairly aggressive when the GPU spikes, so you'll notice a bit of noise during intense battles, but it drops back to a whisper once the action settles. If you're sensitive to fan whine, the trade-off is that you get consistent cooling without having to tweak fan profiles yourself. Storage-wise, the Poseidon ships with a 1TB PCIe NVMe SSD for the operating system and main games, plus a 2TB SATA SSD for bulk storage. That arrangement solves the classic fast boot but slow library problem. I installed a handful of AAA titles on the NVMe drive and they loaded in under a second, while my media collection lives comfortably on the larger SATA drive. The 3TB total is generous for most gamers, but if you're a collector of 4K video assets or massive mod packs, you might still need an external drive down the line. Now, let's talk about who should actually consider buying this machine. If you're a mainstream gamer who wants a ready-to-play system, doesn't want to hunt for compatible parts, and appreciates a sleek white case that fits into a modern office or bedroom, the Poseidon is a solid pick. It also makes sense for students or creators who need decent CPU horsepower for video editing or 3D modeling without investing in a workstation-grade machine. The inclusion of DDR5 memory future-proofs the rig a bit,